Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The job of a state attorney general is at least twofold. Certainly as the state's top cop, that is head of law enforcement in most cases, but just as importantly, and maybe even more relevant, as the chief advocate for the state. Welcome back, and thank you for supporting the most widely watched program on business and public policy in North and South Carolina. I'm Chris William, and this time North Carolina Attorney General Roy Cooper is back. So from politics to immigration to healthcare to education and beyond, the question is what motivates him and how does this four-term political boss operate? We will start in just a moment.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded March 10th, 2015. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring Roy Cooper, North Carolina Attorney General. And now, here's Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program, and Your Honor, welcome back. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your show and always appreciate being on.
Thank you, sir. We talked about, so, Mr. Attorney General, what is your job now? Is it the top cop in the state? Is it legal advisor? Is it advocate to state government and citizens? What do you do?
I think it's all of the above. Certainly, I serve as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of North Carolina, but also represent consumers and represent the state of North Carolina when it gets sued. We provide legal opinions to people who ask for it. Pretty much you name the issue, and I can tell you how our office is involved in it in one way or another. It's a great job. I've loved doing it, and there are many opportunities to help the people of the state.
So you've done it 4 terms now.
In the middle of my 4th term, yes.
In the middle of your 4th term. Thank you for that. You have been Senate Majority Leader. You've been in the House. And certainly there's a lot of dialogue, Your Honor, going on around the state that gosh, he's going to run for governor. He should run for governor. I'm not going to ask you if you want to be governor, if you're going to run for governor, but what situation, what would have to be in place for you to decide that you wanted to go for that job?
Well, first, I've also had my own private law practice and was the managing partner of my law firm in addition to serving in the legislature. It's too early for an official announcement on the governor's race, but I am making plans to do that because I'm concerned about the direction that our state is headed. I think it's critically important that we make investments so that we can have good workforce preparedness. And I talk to CEOs. The first question most of them ask is, do you have the people who can perform the jobs that I create? Mm-hmm. Whether it's a company that we're trying to get to move here or to expand here. And we need to make sure that we have investments in public schools, our community colleges and universities to provide the analytical training and skills that people need to do those jobs. And I'm very concerned about the decisions that have been made that I believe have cut back in those investments.
So, this is good. Thank you for that. You tee that up a little bit. So, how do you, Mr. Attorney General, you've got certainly a Republican-controlled General Assembly in North Carolina now. You've got a Republican governor. How could a Democratic governor, let's just assume that you run, and let's assume that you run and you win, How will the civility of discourse be different than it is now, and you've got everyone on the same side of the aisle? How would it be if we've got a Democratic governor and a fairly aggressive Republican GA out there?
Well, you have to do more than talk about reaching a hand across the aisle. You have to actually do it. When I served in the state legislature, we had a situation where I was in a Democratic Senate and we had a Republican House. And I was often the one who was chosen to negotiate any type of agreement that the legislature would come up with between the two bodies. I think I have experience in bringing Republicans and Democrats together to come to reasonable solutions for our state. And we have to do more than just talk about that. We actually have to do it. And I think that when we talk about our state, we all love our state, Republicans and Democrats. Sometimes we have different ideas about how to come up with the best solutions, but we need to make sure that we work together to try to find reasonable solutions, and sometimes that means compromise, and that's not a bad word sometimes.
Well, and I would agree, and a lot of people speak fairly broadly, Mr. Attorney General, but what are those practical ways? How did you reach out? How did you make sure that your political opponent, at least, didn't feel like you were oppositional?
Well, the first thing you have to do is know the issues. The second thing you have to do is to understand where the person you disagree with is coming from. You know, what is their factual basis for believing how they believe? And then trying to bring in experts and others who know about the particular issue, you know, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's law enforcement, to help us run by solutions, potential compromises, ways to make sure that we come up with an answer that helps the people instead of just lobbing the bombs. That's going to happen anyway. You're going to have the partisan discourse. The thing is, can you work underneath the shelling, so to speak, to get the job done? And I've got experience doing that, and I certainly hope to continue doing that in North Carolina in the future.
You made a reference at the top of the program here, sir. You're talking about how, do you have the right people in place? Do you have the talent to run the organizations and also to be deeper in the organizations? Thank you on behalf of the citizens of North Carolina and in fact the Carolinas for being ahead of being the AG and winning $300 million in the mortgage settlement in 2012 and now $21.5 million from S&P recently. That seems to be going, and I'm going to let you delineate this a little bit, but part of those funds is to make sure that you don't lose the talent that you have in your financial fraud unit, in the Attorney General's office. So how, besides just increasing pay, how do you attract good talent to government service?
Well, I go out personally sometimes and tell lawyers, look, I know you're making a lot more money in the private sector, but can you give me 2 years? Can you give me 3 years of your talent for public service? You may be arguing a case in the United States Supreme Court. You may do things you've never done before. I think we try to lure people into public service sometimes just for short times. They don't have to necessarily be career state employees. We do, however, for certain positions, have to work to make people understand that we've got to pay a little more in order to keep good talent. For example, we've got forensic scientists who work very hard in state government, but they can easily be lured by private labs. We spend almost 2 years training them, spend taxpayer money doing that. Then they leave for someone who pays them 10 grand a year more. We can step up and meet that challenge to try to retain that person. We do that in academia. We ought to be able to do that in more areas in state government in order to be able to retain the talent that we've already paid for to be there.
You know, that leads into economic development, innovation, which is, as you well know, is a front burner issue for North Carolina.
No question.
Feel the heat from South Carolina competing and in many cases winning economic development. Does Governor McCrory, is he on the right track with the public-private partnership and the change in commerce? Is this going in the right direction?
We have to wait and see how that works. I think bottom line for Department of Commerce, we need the very best people who understand all parts of North Carolina, our thriving urban areas and our struggling rural areas, and know what they have to sell. And then they're out there with their knowledge, pushing North Carolina, finding prospects. And don't forget, they're working within our own borders. For the businesses that we already have here, we need to make sure that they know they are valued. And when they consider expansion here, we want to make sure that we're providing them what they need in order to expand. We'll see how this public-private partnership works. There are some potentials for conflicts of interest. But I don't want to just discard it. I want it to work, because we've got to make sure that we get better paying jobs in North Carolina, and recruitment is going to be one of the best ways we do that, because we do have a lot to sell here in this great state.
So how does the state get its mojo back when it comes to economic development? For a while, it was on a roll, and for many years. But it seems like North Carolina's a little back on its heels.
Yeah, I think we are back on our heels, and one of the reasons, even though our unemployment is going down, which is positive, the median household income is also dropping, which means that people are working at jobs that are paying less than before the recession. We've also been concerned, and I've certainly been concerned about our education system, our community colleges and universities. There's a perception out there, not only within the state, but nationally, that we are beginning a slide into mediocrity with our education. And let's don't forget, our universities and community colleges are an economic engine for North Carolina, perhaps our most important one. And I think there's a perception out there that we're letting those slide. And the perception is reality, because we are cutting back funding significantly to these institutions, which should be providing that workforce training that you and I were talking about at the very beginning.
So how do you, and I know your alma mater has been in the news recently, not for their great win-loss record or vice versa, but really more about the economic development model that they are. President Ross released a report just a few weeks ago about the economic viability of the system. As Republicans and as a UNC Board of Governors now that's heavy Republican, and I don't think there's any surprise about that, Mr. Attorney General, but as the Republicans look at the UNC system, what would you advise them to do?
Well, look at it as an economic engine. Look at the billions of dollars of impact that it has on our state and how it creates jobs. Also look at it not just as a training ground for specific jobs, although that can happen. We've got to get students ready with analytical and thinking skills that prepare them for jobs that we may not even be able to imagine what they're going to be 10 years from now. That's one of the great things that a university system can do. A philosophy major can head up a major technology company, because we do invest in education, and because we're getting people thinking analytically and critically and ready to go out there and work. And I would encourage them to do that. I'm concerned that partisan politics is creeping into the governance of the university. Our faculty retention rates are slipping, and there is general concern among researchers and academics that our state may not be as committed to education, and particularly our universities, as we once were. I think we've got the greatest university system in the country. We need to keep it that way. It's a bedrock of our state constitution, and it's also a strong economic engine for us in North Carolina.
And not to chase this down a rabbit hole, but it's worth asking a final question. So and I don't want to turn this into a Democrat versus Republican, Republican versus Democrat.
It should not be.
Thank you, and thank you for saying that at the top of our dialogue here. How I get the sense that everything the Republicans have done, at least the UNC Board of Governors over the entire system, not the Chapel Hill group, but the system, is not all about just trying to eviscerate the education system, that there's some thoughtfulness here. Would you agree?
No, I think that many members of the Board of Governors love, and probably all of them love, or they wouldn't be doing this job, love our university. They may have a different opinion on how the university ought to operate. Some may have the opinion that we don't need state appropriations in our university system, that we should get by on private donations and tuition and fees. A really bad idea, and not the North Carolina that we know, and it certainly will tarnish a university system that has been the envy of the rest of the country. So there's different approaches, as I said earlier, about how we ought to move forward. I do think that we ought to find different ways to select the Board of Governors so that we take partisan politics out of the process as much as possible, because our universities are too important, and we have to approach it in a bipartisan, really a nonpartisan way. You've got more unaffiliated people out there. That's a growing class of people because they're frustrated with both political parties, and it's understandable with all of the back and forth that they hear in the media and read about in the papers. So we've got to be able to sit down and come up with reasonable solutions, but they ought to be solutions that make for a stronger education system in North Carolina, and one that we can use to create jobs.
Both Carolinas, North and South Carolina, have refused to take federal Medicaid dollars. It's no surprise to you, sir. Is there a way to compel the state of North Carolina legally to take these dollars and to make a point?
It is one of the worst ideas around to refuse to take these federal dollars that will help provide health insurance for hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians. What we're doing is leaving billions of dollars on the table in tax money that we have already paid to Washington, D.C. And even if you don't agree with the Affordable Care Act, the fact that the decision has been made, these dollars are available for North Carolinians, we as North Carolina taxpayers are going to pick up the slack for people who get treated. Private insurance may go up. There's some studies to show that it might, because of this refusal to expand Medicaid that's been offered. So we should do it. The tens of thousands of jobs that it creates says we should do it. Now, whether there's a way to legally compel the state, I don't think so, because Congress clearly left an option that the state can operate its own exchange, or if they don't, the federal government will come up with an exchange, and that's what is happening in North Carolina, and over 500,000 North Carolinians have taken advantage of that and are receiving subsidies to get themselves insured.
So what happens with that debate as it goes to the Supreme Court and some decision around this summer about the viability of all those North Carolinians, and you could say South Carolinians too, that have gone to take the federal exchange? Will that come around and kind of bite us in the rear?
I can't believe that Congress intended to treat these two classes of people differently.
Yeah.
I just don't believe that that was their intention. I signed an amicus brief in the United States Supreme Court asking that North Carolinians be allowed to get their federal subsidy. We want them to continue to be insured, and if they lose that federal subsidy, many of them will have to give up their insurance, and then it's once again back on the taxpayers, back on the private employers to have to make up the difference. So I'm hoping the Supreme Court will allow the North Carolina patients who are under this plan and getting these federal subsidies to continue to receive them.
Do you ever talk to your counterpart in South Carolina, Alan Wilson,
yes,
about
I
this
do.
at all?
Yes.
And what's the rationale with their idea of?
I don't think we've talked that much about this particular issue. Obviously, Alan feels very strongly about it and doesn't believe that South Carolina should be taking part in this. I must admit that I have had a hard time understanding the rationale for this. What has been stated is that down the road, potentially, the state might incur some additional cost because the 100% is only for several years. But when you look at the overall economic impact, it's a strong positive for the state to accept this money that we've already paid. That argument is over and it's there. It's almost like federal highway money. I mean, you should take it. It's there. We've paid the money. Let's don't turn it down. I still have some hope for the situation and hope that it can happen.
Do you think we hit a tipping point when it's, well, we've got to take it now? Do you think that?
I hope so. We should have been there last year, but we're not there yet. So I'm going to keep talking about it. I know many people in the healthcare profession, doctors, hospital CEOs, rural economic developers, they're talking to the governor and to legislators saying, please, we've got rural hospitals that are on the edge. We've got people that are working. We're talking about working North Carolinians. We're talking about people struggling, living on the edge. This is something that's been made available by the federal government. North Carolinians ought to take advantage of it.
We've got about 5 minutes left, Mr. Attorney General, and we talked about healthcare, education to some degree, policy, politics. What gets lost a lot in the debate, and I know this is not going to be lost on you, but what gets lost a lot in the debate is Chief Justice in North Carolina, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Chief Justice in North Carolina, Martin, has asked the General Assembly, has made the case for $30 million for funding the courts, the administration of the courts, I think is the right way to say that.
Administrative office of the court.
Thank you. My dyslexia is showing itself.
No.
Why is that important in all the other debates that we get into? And I know this is very complex, but why is that important to and I think the General Assembly's thinking about a $5 million number and Chief Justice is asking for 30, that's a pretty big gap. Yeah. Why is that important to figure out that funding?
Because justice is important and access to justice is important. Let's just talk about, since you have a lot of business people watching the show, let's talk about businesses. I was one of the state legislators who introduced the legislation to help set up the business courts. And we used that in North Carolina as an economic development tool. Businesses, come to North Carolina. We have a way for you to quickly and efficiently settle your legal disputes by a judge who understands business issues, and we can get it done and not let it languish. I think he's asked for expansion of the business court, which I think that is critically important, but that same example is all over the judicial system, whether it's family courts, whether it's criminal law. Oftentimes, when you have delays in the process, it can cause significant problems in attaining justice. So if we're going to have places where people can resolve their problems, where our prosecutors can work to make sure that we put criminals in jail, then we've got to have a system that works, and they've got to be properly funded. Technology is woefully behind in the judicial system.
Would a big part of that ask be for a technology upgrade?
That and salary increases to keep good people in the system. But clearly there are a lot of needs, and he only touched on a few of them. That's just one of the many issues that this General Assembly is going to be facing as they consider the budget coming up.
Is there, and I know no one wants to go back to a specific industrial sector and say, help us fund this, but I think the general consensus is that most law firms are not short on cash, that are fairly flush. Is there a way to include the industry, the law industry, in helping figure out what this is, or does that set a bad precedent?
It might set a bad precedent because people might think that whoever's investing in the system might get something out of it. However, there are many law firms, and I continue to encourage this, who do pro bono work, who volunteer for nothing to help people who can't afford representation in the civil courts. I think that's something that we've got to continue, because we have seen cutbacks in legal aid and other organizations that help people who can't get access to justice. So we do need to encourage these law firms to be a part of the pro bono system and to help. But I think probably private contributions into the public legal system might set a bad precedent.
I wish we had more time. Please come back. I know it's been a few years, but we'd love to have you back.
I'd love to be back, Chris, and I will.
this out.
I'll be in Charlotte a lot, so we'll see each other.
Okay, and thank you for your leadership on the settlement from the mortgage industry as well as this S&P number. That was good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Nice to see you. I'm Chris William, and thank you so much for watching this program. Almost 25 years now, and you continue to support it. Thank you. If you have any suggestions or comments, we hope you will go to carolinabusinessreview.org. We wish it weren't such a clumsy website name, but that's as close as we get. carolinabusinessreview.org, and make your comments and your suggestions. Thank you again for watching. Until next week, I'm Chris William. May your business and your weekend be good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.